The world was white and dead. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes that swallowed every sound until the war itself seemed to hold its breath. Beneath the jagged ribs of a collapsed farmhouse, a lone soldier crouched beside his rifle, the barrel wrapped in cloth, the scope glinting faintly beneath a frozen sky. His breath came in clouds, quick and shallow, each one rising and vanishing like a ghost. Somewhere beyond the mist, the earth trembled. Metal engines, a column of tanks moved through the ruin-strewn valley, their tracks grinding over the bones of winter. He shifted slightly, the frost biting through his gloves. The air was so cold it rang in his ears, and even the smallest movement cracked like glass. He could smell oil, smoke, and the distant, sour scent of cordite, reminders that death was never far, only waiting its turn. Around him, the village lay silent, windows shattered, doors hanging loose. What had once been home was now only a map of suffering drawn in snow and ash. He looked through his handmade scope, a piece of scavenged glass, balanced by wire and faith, and saw the tanks gliding closer. No orders had come. His unit was gone. The radio, dead. He was one man against an army of steel. And yet, in that frozen silence, something ancient stirred, a defiance too stubborn to die. He adjusted his aim, his fingers steady despite the cold. Somewhere deep within, instinct took over where discipline had ended. The first tank rumbled into his sightline. The story of what would happen next, of how one man's invention would outthink a machine, had not yet begun. But history was already listening in the quiet. The shot broke the silence like a scream through glass. For a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to flinch. Collins felt the rifle's kick slam into his shoulder, harder than he'd expected, and the fragile scope shuddered beneath the impact. The lens cracked at the edge, a thin spiderweb spreading like frost, but through it, he saw the impossible. The lead tank halted, its turret jerking, smoke bleeding from the hatch. He had struck steel from half a kilometer away. For a single breath, he forgot the cold. Triumph flooded him, hot, electric, intoxicating, the kind that makes a man believe he's outsmarted death itself. But as the echo faded, reality clawed back. The scope's focus drifted, blurring the world into ghostly shapes. His heartbeat filled his ears, each thud reminding him that one more pull of the trigger might shatter the glass completely. He steadied his hands, adjusting the alignment by instinct. The wire mount trembled. Every inch of the contraption was a gamble, the kind of invention no officer would approve, and no manual would ever mention. Yet it had worked. Against every rule, it had worked. Collins exhaled, the vapor trembling before his face. He thought of the men out there in those tanks, faceless, mechanical silhouettes, and wondered if they felt fear too. His finger hovered over the trigger, hesitation crawling up his spine. The cold didn't just bite now. It whispered, doubt, fragility, fate. The second tank lurched forward, turning its gun toward the ruins. He had seconds to decide, risk everything for another shot, or preserve the miracle he'd built. Between genius and ruin, there was only one breath, and Collins was about to take it. The second shot came softer, less a blast, more a heartbeat caught in the cold. Then, silence. Heavy, unbroken, unnatural. The kind that makes even war forget to breathe. Collins lowered his cheek to the rifle stock, his eye pressed to the fractured glass. Through the distortion, he saw it, the lead tank frozen mid-motion, its treads half buried in snow. The machine's engine coughed once, then went still. A strange quiet rolled across the field. The other tanks hesitated, their formation rippling like a living thing suddenly unsure of itself. Men appeared on the hatches, black shapes against the white, shouting words lost to the wind. Collins couldn't hear them, but he didn't need to. Confusion was universal. Even from here, he could see panic settling in. He adjusted the lens carefully, his breath fogging the cracked edge. Each movement felt enormous. The world inside that scope became everything, a tiny theater where death, fear, and disbelief played their parts in perfect rhythm. His pulse thumped against his glove, matching the slow, deliberate rhythm of his breathing. In that moment, time stretched thin. Snowflakes drifted like ash between him and his targets. One soldier jumped from the turret, slipping as he landed, his rifle clattering away. Another pointed toward the ruins, shouting, searching for the invisible ghost that had just crippled their armor. Collins didn't move. The silence wasn't safety, it was suspense. He could feel it vibrating through the frozen air, the weight of eyes unseen. His rifle rested still, his mind locked in a trance between terror and triumph. For the first time since dawn, even the war seemed to stop, waiting, just as he was, to see what would happen next. Collins wiped the frost from his trembling fingers. Every movement mechanical, practiced, desperate. The scope's cracked lens gleamed dully, catching the pale light of the burning tank ahead. He had no tools, no manual, only intuition sharpened by survival. With a fragment of wire and a strip of torn cloth, he bound the fractured mount tighter against the barrel. The adjustment wasn't perfect, but perfection no longer mattered. Precision did. He breathed once, steadying the tremor in his hands. The world around him was breaking apart. Distant explosions thudded like a monstrous heartbeat, shaking the snow loose from the roofs of the dead village. Shouts echoed through the smoke. Somewhere, a German engine roared back to life. But inside Collins's mind, there was only geometry, wind, distance, angle, breath. The chaos outside became background noise to the science of survival. He reloaded, the cartridge sliding in with a click that sounded louder than the artillery. His shoulder ached, his eyes burned, but the rhythm returned. Aim, exhale, fire. Each shot was an equation solved under pressure. Every correction a lesson learned in blood and ice. The second tank lurched forward, its turret turning toward him. Collins tracked it, adjusted half a degree, squeezed the recoil bit hard, but the round flew true. Fire bloomed from the hatch like a sunrise made of metal and flame. In that instant, instinct replaced invention. He no longer thought about the scope, the risk, or the rules. He simply became the weapon he had built, a fusion of mind and machine forged by necessity. Amid the ruin and snow, the soldier vanished, and only precision remained. Smoke coiled above the valley like a dark flag, twisting in the cold wind. The tanks that had once advanced with mechanical certainty now sat motionless, steel giants, uncertain and afraid. Collins adjusted the scope once more, the cracked lens framing a scene that felt almost unreal. Through it, he saw hesitation ripple through the enemy line. Commanders shouted conflicting orders, heads ducked below hatches, and engines sputtered without direction. He fired again, one round, sharp and precise, striking the snow beside a distant tank. It wasn't a hit. It didn't need to be. The illusion was complete. To those men, there was no single marksman in the ruins. There was a team hidden, coordinated, deadly. Collins's homemade scope had multiplied him in their minds, turning solitude into strategy. The tanks began to reverse, treads grinding, leaving deep scars in the snow. Soldiers dismounted, taking cover behind their own machines, scanning rooftops and shadows that hid no one. The fear was visible even from afar, a battlefield gripped not by bullets, but by belief. Collins watched, his pulse steady for the first time. He had turned broken glass and scavenged wire into something greater than weaponry, into influence. His invention had reshaped the rhythm of war itself. Where firepower failed, perception triumphed. As the last tank vanished behind a ridge, the silence returned, deeper than before. Collins lowered the rifle, the metal warm from his hands. In that stillness, he realized what he had built wasn't just a tool for killing. It was proof that ingenuity could terrify armies more than artillery. The battlefield, once ruled by machines, now obeyed a man with nothing but courage and glass. The message reached headquarters. Before dawn, a single transmission buried among the chaos of victory reports. Somewhere near the Ardennes line, a lone infantryman had stopped a tank column. No artillery, no support, just a rifle and a homemade scope. The claim sounded absurd, even offensive to military logic. By morning, Collins was ordered back to base, not as a hero, but as a suspect. Inside the drafty command tent, the air was colder than the snow outside. Officers in pressed uniforms stared across the table at him, their disbelief sharper than any weapon. Unauthorized modification of government property, one of them read aloud, voice brittle with protocol. Another added, acting without command, approval under active combat. The words came like charges in a courtroom, not questions for a soldier who had just survived. Collins sat still, hands folded. His knuckles were raw, his uniform still flecked with soot. He tried to explain the broken sight, the glass, the angles, how he'd improvised what no manual had ever taught. But as he spoke, their faces hardened. Ingenuity, to them, was not bravery. It was defiance. Outside, the men he'd fought beside whispered his name with a different tone, part awe, part fear. They didn't understand how one man could change the tide of a battle. Inside, The officers didn't want to. The silence stretched. Collins realized that the war he'd just fought in the snow wasn't over. It had simply changed uniforms. The battlefield had traded explosions for suspicion and victory for paperwork. When they dismissed him, it wasn't with gratitude, but with a warning. Innovation had saved lives, but in the eyes of command, it had broken rules. And in war, that was its own kind of crime. They took it from him before he could even clean the lens. The scope, if it could be called that, sat awkwardly on the officer's desk, a patchwork of scavenged glass and rifle steel, soldered by desperation. To the untrained eye, it looked like junk. To the men who had watched through it, it was survival itself. In the mechanic's tent, engineers circled the device like vultures over a curiosity. One snorted, "This thing shouldn't even work." Another pried the metal seam with a screwdriver, muttering, "He got lucky, blind luck." The others nodded, relieved to dismiss it. They wanted a formula, not a miracle. But when they finally mounted the scope to a testing rifle and fired, the laughter faded. The first shot tore through the target dead. The second, same result. Even the wind outside couldn't sway its precision. Silence filled the tent. One engineer scribbled notes faster. Another frowned like he'd seen a ghost. Still, the report they filed later read, "Non-standard, unfit for mass production. Results inconclusive." Bureaucracy had no column for brilliance born out of panic. Collins wasn't invited to the demonstration. He sat outside, watching snow collect on his boots, hearing faint metallic echoes from the testing range. The weapon that had made him both savior and outcast was now being stripped for parts. Its story rewritten without him. That night, as lamps flickered across the camp, he realized something cruel. Inventions are only celebrated when they fit inside the system that failed to imagine them. His creation had done the impossible. Yet it wasn't supposed to exist, and for that reason alone, it never would, at least. Not officially. When Collins returned to his post, no one looked up. The same mud, the same wind, the same weary faces, only now, he moved through them as though behind glass. Orders were shouted over the snow, boots stomped, rifles clattered, and yet his name was never spoken. The man who had stopped a column of tanks might as well have never existed. At mess, he sat alone. The laughter of younger soldiers rose and fell like distant artillery, sounds from another world. Once, a mechanic passed by and muttered, "Heard they took your toy." Collins didn't answer. He only stared at his tin plate, tracing circles in the cold gravy until it turned grey. Nights were the worst. He'd lie awake under the thin canvas roof, the frost thickening on his blanket, listening to the muffled hum of engines and the occasional whistle of distant shells. The front had gone quiet, but his thoughts hadn't. Every sound, the clink of a shell casing, the crack of settling ice, reminded him of the rhythm he'd found through his scope. Precision, control, purpose, now replaced by silence. There were no medals, no commendations, not even a reprimand. Just absence, the kind that doesn't fade, only deepens. Sometimes, he caught himself glancing toward the field where the tanks had burned, still expecting to see the faint shimmer of heat rising from the wrecks. It was as if the battlefield itself had remembered him when the army chose to forget. He smiled once, a quiet, private thing, thinking that maybe being unseen was the price of doing something impossible. And though no one saluted him, he carried his invisible victory like a secret medal, engraved only in memory. The paper was thin, the kind that tore if you pressed too hard. Collins wrote by lantern light, the flame flickering against the tent walls, like ghosts of the men he'd outlived. His gloves lay beside him, stiff with frost and gun oil. The pencil shook between his fingers, not from fear, but from the cold that never truly left his bones. "Dear Tom," he began. The words felt foreign after so many months of silence. "Things have gone quiet here, quieter than they should." He paused, watching the ink pool in the creases of the page. "I made something that helped me see clearer than ever before." He didn't explain the scope, not really. Instead, he wrote about clarity, how in the heart of chaos, when everything screams to survive, the world sharpens into truth. "Out there, you stop thinking about orders or medals," he wrote. "You think about how far a breath travels in the cold, and how still your hands can stay when it counts." Between sentences, he listened to the wind outside, the low whistle threading through barbed wire, like the front breathing in its sleep. He ended the letter simply, "Don't worry if you don't hear from me again. I'm all right. I can see things better now, not just through glass, but through what matters." He folded it carefully, sealing it with the corner of tape from a ration pack. Then he placed it with the others, letters that might never leave the war, as he blew out the lantern. The darkness felt softer than it had in months. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace finally making its way home. The morning came without color, just a grey mist that clung to the earth like breath on glass. Collins crouched behind a shattered wall, his rifle balanced on broken stone. Beyond the fog, voices rose, medics shouting, stretcher bearers running. They were retreating under fire. He could see the muzzle flashes before he saw the men. The war had not ended. It had only grown quieter, more personal. He steadied the rifle. The lens was cracked now, spider-webbing the world into fragments. Still, through those splinters, he could see movement, the faint outline of a machine gun nest cutting down the wounded as they fell back. He exhaled, long and even. One last calculation, one last chance to matter. The shot came like a whisper. The recoil jolted through his shoulder, followed by the clean silence that only comes after something ends. The target fell. The medics disappeared into the fog, their shouts fading into distance. He lowered the rifle and looked through the cracked scope once more. The glass had finally given way, collapsing into a blur of light and shadow. For a moment, it reflected his own eye, calm, steady, unafraid. Around him, the air smelled of cordite and cold soil. The war moved on without him, as wars always do. No witness, no glory, no sound but the slow hiss of snow against steel. Collins rested the rifle beside him and watched the fog swallow the field. His breath grew shallow, his heartbeat slowing to the rhythm of the world he'd tried to see more clearly. In the distance, the tanks rumbled again, faint, almost imagined. Then even they were gone, leaving behind only silence and a cracked piece of glass that had once seen everything. The war ended, not with thunder, but with stillness. The guns fell silent, the snow melted, and the earth exhaled after years of holding its breath. Collins came home with the others, a face in a crowd, a name on a roster. No medals, no mentions, just the quiet shuffle of boots on train platforms, and the smell of oil and smoke that somehow followed him even into peace. He found work at a machinist's shop on the edge of town. Steel instead of rifles, measurements instead of orders, the same precision, but without the urgency of survival. He turned metal under the hiss of the lathe, watching sparks fly like tiny suns, and thought of the scope, his scope, dismantled, dismissed, forgotten. Some nights, when the factory lights dimmed, he'd catch himself adjusting the focus on an imaginary lens, his fingers tracing the air as though memory itself were a mechanism that could still be repaired. The world around him moved forward, new cars, new radios, new wars brewing far away. Yet inside, he lived in two places at once, the roar of the front and the hum of the shop floor. The distance between them was measured not in miles, but in meaning. Neighbors called him steady, quiet, a good worker. None knew that his hands had once held the power to change the course of a battle. At the back of his drawer, wrapped in oilcloth, he kept a small shard of glass, the last fragment of the homemade scope. It caught the light when he opened it, bending the world just slightly, as if reminding him that clarity, once found, is never truly lost, only waiting for the right light to return. History has a way of polishing the wrong names. In the years that followed, books were written, documentaries filmed, and medals awarded, all to men who had never known the weight of a cracked lens or the cold of a foxhole. Collins' scope, born in desperation and made from scrap, was never mentioned. At first he thought it an oversight. Then, as new rifles appeared with familiar optics, sleeker, cleaner, manufactured by the very institutions that once called him reckless, he understood. His creation had lived on, but not his name. The idea survived. The man did not. He saw it once in a newspaper photo, a soldier aiming through a scope that looked almost identical to his own design. A breakthrough in precision targeting. The caption read. Collins folded the paper slowly, placed it on the table, and stared at the blackened fingertips that had once shaped metal under fire. No bitterness showed on his face, but something behind his eyes dimmed. The injustice wasn't loud. It didn't come with accusations or anger. It was quieter, like the hum of the lathe that followed him even in dreams. A reminder that genius, when born in the wrong place, can be buried under bureaucracy and forgotten beneath medals it never received. Sometimes, while locking up the shop, he'd glance toward the evening sky, watching contrails cross in the fading light, The precision of their flight stirred something in him. Admiration, pride, maybe even resignation. He smiled faintly, thinking that perhaps the world had found use for his clarity after all, even if it no longer remembered its source. Then he turned the key, closed the door, and disappeared once more into history's quiet margins. It began with dust, the kind that settles over forgotten years and secrets no one thought to ask about. In a dimly lit corner of a military museum storage wing, an intern brushed past a shelf of corroded steel and splintered wood. There, half buried in a crate labeled MISC, Optics, Eastern Front, lay the remains of something strange, a tube, rough-edged and uneven, its glass fractured but still catching light. Inside, faintly etched with a trembling hand, SCTHE curator almost dismissed it, another battlefield relic, another nameless tool of war. But the initials lingered. A report was written, a photo catalogued, and within weeks, it landed on the desk of Dr. Evelyn Marin, a historian known for chasing whispers. She studied the artifact under sterile light, noting the irregular craftsmanship, too crude for factory issue, too precise for chance. Then, buried within old field records, she found it, a brief mention of Private Samuel Collins, unauthorized optical attachment, Eastern Sector, 1944. Her pulse quickened. The report was brief, the tone bureaucratic, unapproved device, dismantled for review. No commendation, no follow-up, just a line that might have been lost forever. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, the hum of the archive's lights filling the silence. What drove a soldier to build this, alone in the cold? How had something born of desperation become so sophisticated, so quietly revolutionary? Outside, the snow fell as it had that winter long ago, blanketing the city in silence. In her hands, the cracked scope seemed to pulse with memory, a fragment of forgotten brilliance, resurfacing just when history was ready to listen. The myth, it seemed, had been waiting all along. Vision, that was always the heart of it. Not just what Collins saw through the glass, but how he chose to see when others couldn't. In a world collapsing under smoke and snow, he built clarity with his bare hands. Every soldier on that front was blind to something: orders, fear, survival. But Collins looked past the chaos and found meaning in precision. Dr. Marin stood before the cracked scope, the museum lights dimming to a soft amber glow. Through its warped lens, she could still make out the faint crosshairs, uneven but resolute. It wasn't perfection that made it powerful, it was intent. Collins had seen not just targets, but patterns, not just war, but the machinery of humanity inside it. She imagined him on that frozen day, his breath misting, his hands trembling, his mind focused. A man trying to see beyond destruction, trying to make sense of what his superiors dismissed as madness. That vision, she realized, wasn't tactical, it was existential. What he saw wasn't victory, it wasn't even survival. It was possibility that in the middle of ruin, one mind could still create, still invent, still hope. The scope wasn't just an invention, it was a rebellion against blindness, against the dull obedience of war. As she closed the archive box, Marin understood the story wasn't about a weapon or a war. It was about the courage to see differently, to focus when the world demanded you look away. And perhaps, she thought, that's what every act of heroism really is, not the firing of a shot, but the moment someone decides to truly see. The wind returned, cold, hollow, unchanging. It swept across a field long silent, brushing against rusted metal and forgotten helmets half buried in frost. The same sound that once carried the echoes of Collins' rifle now whispered through the relics of history. War had moved on, technology advanced, armies rearmed, yet the soul behind that homemade scope remained untouchable. Official reports never spoke his name. Doctrine never mentioned the soldier who saw differently. The manuals preached regulation. The generals enforced obedience. But it was always the rule breakers, the quiet innovators in the mud and snow, who bent fate just enough to save lives. Collins was one of them, a man who disobeyed not for pride, but for clarity. His lens became a metaphor, invisible yet persistent, a way of looking that defied hierarchy. Each generation of engineers, snipers, and soldiers unknowingly carried a trace of that defiance in their craft. The weapons changed, the uniforms changed, but the instinct to improvise under pressure, that was his inheritance to them all. Dr. Marin's final entry in the archive catalogue read simply, Artifact number 1127, improvised optical device, Estimated origin: Eastern Front, winter 1944. Significance: vision beyond regulation. She closed the file and listened. The hum of the museum faded, replaced by the faint howl of the wind against steel. The story had come full circle. From a frozen village to a silent exhibit. From the eye of one soldier to the eyes of countless others. And as the snow settled once more on forgotten metal, the message endured that genius doesn't survive in medals or ranks, but in the echoes of those who dared to see what others never could.